Everyone. All right, excellent. I'm Jim Register, President and CEO of BioConnect Iowa, and along with our partners at ISU Startup Factory and VentureNet Iowa, we run the Iowa Go-to-Market or G2M Accelerator. On behalf of the entire G2M team, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's panel discussion on capital acquisition for high-tech, high-growth potential Iowa startups. So the genesis of this session is that being a follow-on or maybe second stage accelerator, focusing on companies that have already participated in an early stage accelerator or entrepreneur development program, the G2M program isn't particularly curriculum or workshop heavy, but we do run some in areas we view as being critically important for startup success. And one such area, not surprisingly, is capital acquisition. And we concluded following a workshop that was facilitated by Matt Kinley of Manchester Story, which is a Des Moines-based VC firm, that the workshop that he'd run could be complemented with a session in which multiple perspectives from different ecosystem stakeholders could be shared. And as that idea developed, we thought that it provided the accelerator with a nice opportunity to not only contribute to the cohort of companies that we're working with right now, but the startup community more broadly. And that's really the crux of today's session and what got it started. We will also be doing another one somewhat similar in July that will soon be announced, giving exposure to a variety of organizations in Iowa that provide different types of entrepreneur support that complement programs like accelerators. So there'll be more on that later. But to bring us back to today's session, I think we've got 6 panelists joining us today who I feel meet the objectives that I just noted for today's session very, very well, representing the investment community, individuals that work with founders and companies as they're seeking capital, both private investment as well as federal funding, and then also several founders with a range of experiences seeking and acquiring capital in different verticals within Iowa. So with that, then, let me go ahead and introduce our panel. First of all, JD Jenisar. JD is a CPA and senior partner and shareholder at LWBJ. He's held executive positions in privately and publicly traded companies and has more than 30 years of leadership experience in business and financial operations. JD leads LWBJ's investment banking practice, which focuses on raising capital, mergers and acquisitions, due diligence, and operational and financial consulting services. He has assisted and advised in equity transactions in excess of $1 billion. Secondly, Mark Henry. Mark, through his company Grow Emerging Companies, has for the past 41 years worked nationwide with small high-tech firms to raise early stage R&D funding, primarily through the federal Small Business Innovation Research or SBIR program. He's helped raise some $500 million in SBIR related funding and has been introduced by federal program managers as the Vince Lombardi of SBIR programs. And we'll see if anybody other than Mark and I actually even remember who Vince Lombardi was, but we'll leave that to the side for now. Next, Todd Crone. Todd started Power Pollen about 6 years ago after a 20-year career in R&D within the seed industry. Power Pollen is an ag biotech firm working to improve cross-pollination and seed production in major ag crops. As CEO, Todd has led the funding efforts for Power Pollen and has raised a total of $30 million through seed, Series A, and Series B rounds. Next, Clayton Mooney. Clayton is co-founder and CEO of Nebulum, which builds indoor farms that sells fresh produce directly to consumers. And as one of his customers, I can vouch for that. Nebulum is backed by Ag Startup Engine, Y Combinator, ISA Ventures, and angel investors between Iowa and California. Next, Mike Upaw. Mike is director of AIM Seed Capital, which is a community-based venture fund serving Central Iowa. Mike has been involved in technology business development and venture-funded companies since the early 2000s, when he joined the Papa John's Center at Iowa State University to direct the business development function. And then finally, Susan Wood. Susan is CEO of VITA. VITA is a lung and respiratory intelligence company, originally spun off from the University of Iowa, partially funded with help from the IEDA, as well as Iowa-based venture funds. So to start off this session, we've asked each of the panel members to bring to the audience three lessons or learnings, or perhaps mistakes that they've made or seen made, or examples of advice that most stick in their heads as they think about this topic. And what we're going to do is go through the panelists one by one and ask them each to take a few minutes and walk us through their specific examples. We're then going to turn the session over to the audience and the panel for questions and discussions. Now, to try to manage this virtual session effectively, we'd like to ask that all the questions be submitted using the Zoom function within, using the chat function within Zoom. John Callan, who is the G2M Accelerator program's entrepreneur in residence, will then review, collate, combine as appropriate, maybe reword questions, and coordinate providing the questions to the panelists and a subsequent conversation about these points between the panelists, because of course they'll be free to comment on each other's perspectives and so forth. Also helping with today's session is Hannah Kirkendall from the Iowa State Startup Factory, who is managing the Zoom and virtual layout for the session. So with that, let's turn to each panelist's thoughts. And please, as you develop questions, submit them using the chat function so that we can transition quickly to more of a Q&A discussion format after we hear from the panelists. So first, JD.
Thanks, Jim. Can you hear me okay? Okay, well, I appreciate it. Hannah, you're going to have to probably just zap me to shut down at some point. I know we have multiple speakers, and so I'm just going to cover a few things. We work with a lot of early stage companies and then a lot of seed, Series A, Series B rounds. And I thought I would just cover some of the common challenges we have had that take investors' eyes off the process and kind of derail the process and focus on some things that should have already been done. So this is a little bit of some initial prep conversation. And the first one being all your corporate documents, whether you've already had a seed round, a founders round, everything needs to be properly documented, and your capitalization table needs to be up to date, meaning basically who owns what of the company. We've had several capital raises that we've started that either somebody had like a deal with one of the IT people that were doing the development, or something they're gonna get 5%, or they're out raising capital and they haven't even really finished the formulation of the company or the formation of the company. By that, I mean corporate documents, if you're a C Corp, having your shareholder agreement completed, executed, if you're an LLC, having your operating agreement executed and completed. We've had a lot of challenges just with regard to kind of companies going through that process and just not having everything properly documented. The most important thing on that too, and when we work with companies initially, it's we ask who stand that make sure that they have a good attorney to help properly document everything. And again, all that does is take completely the eye off the actual ball from the investor's perspective, and start to think about, well, if they haven't even got the corporate documents completed, or the shareholder agreement completed, or their cap table, you know, we need to kind of take a step back. So it's very important to properly document who owns what of the company and have all the agreements properly in place. The other piece is just knowing your numbers, whether it be understanding how you're setting the valuation of your business, how you're going to utilize the funds, or your financial forecast. And by financial forecasting, it's just grounded assumptions on revenue, pricing, understanding your margins. A lot of times, again, we're kind of focusing on some of the challenges we've had with founders and or company executives raising capital is more of not necessarily owning the pricing points. You've got to understand everything with regard to the financial forecast, how you're going to utilize the funds. And we always start from a perspective of looking at the forecast and understanding how much capital they really need, and then trying to kind of reverse engineer back to say, okay, how much should we really raise? What do you got to get to some inflection points and all of that? And a lot of challenges are around people not necessarily understanding their full, their full forecast. And revenue assumptions should be really grounded on who your target customer is, pricing, how you're going to necessarily distribute your product, sell through your product, et cetera. So we really drive down on the financial forecasts and the numbers. The last piece, and again, each one of these could be an hour-long conversation, so I'm trying to be a little brief here, but is awareness of your market, whether it be, understanding the competitive landscape, who else is in your market, barriers to entry, who your target customer is, and understanding what, the potential exit could be of your company, and really aware of the competitive landscape. And we've seen a lot, when I meet with, companies, it's really more of trying to make sure that they're completely aware of the market they're entering, maybe, vertical competitors. And we see a lot of times investors will ask questions with regard to the market, or even financial questions. And it's interesting because they're not always necessarily interested in the actual answer. They just want to assure themselves that you know the answer. And so it's very, very important that you understand the market you're entering, the pricing, your margins, your cost to serve, your customer acquisition costs, all these things that at the end of the day, you own. And I know some future slides are going to come out, but at the end of the day, they're investing in the management team, the executives, the founders, and they want to make sure you understand, and have the ability to execute. And the final thing I'll say is, it's extremely important to understand that they're really, and most investors want to invest from a perspective of execution capital, not discovery capital. So, these are just, 3 quick examples of areas that already need to be kind of ticked off before you're in front of an investor. They want to make sure that they are investing in the fact that you're going to take these funds now and go execute, not go find a market, not go develop a product, not go, discover pricing points. And so, these are a lot of times just kind of our initial screening meetings that we have with clients to make sure they understand, what they're about to enter into, but also further understand and own whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish. And with that, I was very quick, Jim and Hannah, but those are those
But I
comments.
think that really tees up for some of the subsequent discussion, which is perfect. That's the intent with all of these, is that they serve as, if you will, conversation starters for later. So with that, thanks, JD. We'll turn things over to Mark Henry.
I'm kind of the token federal government funding person here, and I'm going to try to cover a fair bit in my few minutes. That being said, I'll begin with a premise that essentially no blanket statements accurately cover the SBIR program and how it works, or how private funding works, even though I'm going to be making a bunch of blanket statements. That said, many entrepreneurs talk about the need to choose between going after so-called free SBIR money and paying a premium in equity early on for early stage private funding. And we're in that arena all the time trying to help make those decisions. But after decades of working in the SBIR, I guess it's been 41 years now, I've decided that in most cases, you don't have a choice. The stage of development is what dictates the type of funding available for a specific idea and at a particular agency. And all the ideas and agencies are different, of course. There's no such thing as the SBIR program or the STTR program. There are many differences in the types of things they fund, how basic they want their technology. And so the differences in the 11 agencies have a major impact on what stages of development they'll actually consider. And that's true with private funding and different private funds as well. In general, the intent of the SBIR is to support upfront R&D needed to reduce the perceived risk in a new idea to the point at which the private sector will engage. And the private sector is, investors, industry partners, customers. So SBIR is the technology validator for the private sector in many cases. If the private sector, beyond the 4F, family, friends, fools, founders, maybe 5 fraud, all the F's, once you go beyond that, you've got to look at what your options are. And if any of the private money you can get a hold of or look at wants to invest now or soon and expects to see you commercialize in a year or two, it's probably not a legitimate SBIR to consider. It's probably too far along with product development, or it's not challenging enough, or not groundbreaking enough for SBIR. And there are always exceptions, but that's kind of the general rule. They're looking for high risk, high payoff ideas that can take 5 years of R&D to become investable. Very little significant private money is out there for that kind of thing, which is why SBIR exists. There's $3 billion now of SBIR money each year to tee up ideas that can then move on into commercialization with other types of funding. I try to help clients with this issue of deciding what to do by asking them, assuming your idea is as valuable and innovative as you say it is, what's keeping the private sector from handing you a check for $2 or $3 million to allow you to finish development? And that usually stops them for a while. And the technical and economic issues they identify while working through all this to answer the question often forms the basis for a legitimate phase 1 project, or phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 project. That leads into you pay for free government SBIR seed money with time, and usually a lot of time, and that's hard for folks. I've heard a lot of people say, yeah, we got to decide if we can spend that much time on government funding. They often say they're going after private money because government funding is too slow. And they're almost ready to go to market based on what their business plan says. We all know kind of how that goes. So, 2 or 3 years later, the same folks call me up and say, tell me about that SBIR thing again. And they've lost those 2 or 3 years, and they still have to go through the SBIR timeline of 4 to 5 years. And so I think it's important to think about pursuing the government money with certain ideas, and also always be thinking about and pursuing the private sector as a leveraging tool. I try to help clients be realistic early on in terms of judging the stage of development the way that potential investors, and also SBIR reviewers will judge the stage of development. And from that reality-based starting point, we work to capitalize on the great leveraging opportunity that the non-dilutive SBIR funding offers, even with the longer timelines. What's interesting too is that even though they're hot to go and everybody wants to get done fast, probably half of our projects that do get funded end up asking for no cost extensions because they don't get that done on the government timeline. So the way you want to do it and the way reality does it are two different things. The art here involves, matching the phases of SBIR funding with strategically structured private funding, partner funding, industry partners, the series A, B, C types of things work into this timeline at times. And that leads to the next point. You got to know how to leverage SBIR money and private money and vice versa. It's kind of a dance in a lot of instances, and an accurate assessment of the stage development of a new idea is critical. And so is long-term planning. Use a whiteboard, put 5, 7, 10 years on the whiteboard, figure out where private money fits into different ideas and where government money can start funding ideas. A lot of people don't do that. They're thinking about one idea and trying to get an SBIR for one idea, when a lot of times splitting the idea up into different components and working in private sector funding to push those along is important. Just because you have one big idea doesn't mean it has to be all taken care of with one SBIR. Give you an example of that in a couple minutes, or 1 minute maybe. I'm using up my time here. So it all becomes more complicated as you go with potential larger roles for private money as you get into phase 2 and phase 2B, and that takes the strategy part of it. And you can work with private sector partners to figure that all out. I'm going to quit because I'm over my time, but I'll give you an example of this kind of leveraging. When I was at Bend Research managing proposals for the government from 1980 to 1997, we won 175 out of 350 SBIRs. And back then, the SBIRs, phase 1s were maybe 33,000 to 50,000. And we won 47 million in SBIR money, and we leveraged 97 million in private money. And because we figured out how to do that, and we did it with a lot of partner money. And in the process, we obtained 50 patents and spun off 5 companies. And it's not just about winning an SBIR, it's about combining all of that together in a strategy over years. I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So with that, let's shift over to Todd Crone, talk about some of his experiences.
Sorry, can you hear me okay? Great. So I'll start with the key learning, the first bullet there, that investors are investing in you more than your idea and concept. So first, yeah, you have to have some basal level of a credible idea and concept, no question, particularly post-COVID, where most investors are looking for maybe more impactful, virtuous type of investments than they did pre-COVID. So that's true. So I'm not saying just any idea, but once you have that base, really it's all about their trust in you and building that trust. And I'm amazed, a portion of the investors will go to great lengths to check you out, to call people they know in the industry. And most of us are in, fairly, it's a small world, right? And they get to people who know you, and they do their due diligence. And ultimately, they're investing in you, your management team, as I think JD said earlier. And so everything you do, you should be thinking about how to build trust. And that's where transparency, and I like to think of it as a spectrum. When you're pitching, on one end you have all substance, call it all sizzle. On the other end you have all all substance, call it the steak. On the other end you have hype or sizzle. And you kind of want to hit a balance. You don't want to be all substance because you bore people and put them to sleep. You need to be pretty good at telling the story, right? And positioning it well. And there's a middle ground you have to hit. And on one end, if you're all substance, which does build trust, they're bored and they don't invest. On the other end, if you're all sizzle or hype, they lose trust in you completely. And it's, you just have to hit that right balance. That's the bottom line. So that's the first point here. The other thing is, once they've invested, to get them to continue to invest is delivery of bad news. Every company has bad news, bad data, is being very transparent and open and not spinning things. So again, it's building the trust. That's my first key learning over time. The second bullet was around mistakes maybe that we've made, and a mistake that many people, including myself, are that we don't always hunt where the ducks are. And to me, this is very difficult. Early on, in many regards, you kind of follow every single lead you get. It's hard to discern, but you start to learn very quickly to spend the appropriate amount of time based on the potential for that contact. But the difficulty is little contacts that maybe aren't investing a lot might have a network. And so you always want to treat them well. It gets back to your credibility and what they think about you. And I've had many kind of, hey, I think I'll take this call, or I'm curious about this one person. I'll make a call that'll lead to another connection that will lead to a huge investment. So it's not straightforward, but you have to know when you have somebody who's asking for an hour and they're thinking about investing $5,000 or something like that. And there's ways you can manage that, no question. I often will call them 15 minutes before I have another meeting. And there's just strategies you can do. And you can always get through things very quickly in that way. So know where you're spending your time and that it's proportional to where you really have prospects, real prospects. Because I think I saw another comment, you were in fundraise mode, full-time fundraise mode. You got to use your time very wisely. And then the best advice piece is really around, the advice is ask for money and you will get advice, ask for advice and you will get money. And it's related to my first point too, is, go into each interaction with the true motive. You just want to get to know this person, understand their interests, care about them. They may have networks. They may be able to advise you. There's a whole bunch of things they could do and benefit you, in addition to just getting to know a decent human being, and things besides looking at them as a dollar sign, because they will detect that very quickly. And if you push too fast to get to the money, or if you even ask for money, you're more likely just to get advice and no money. And so I never ask for money. When I follow up with investors who I think are interested, I simply say, hey, do you have any questions? They know why I'm asking. If you look in any way desperate, that decreases your leverage. It's similar to dating, of course. Don't look desperate. Even if you are, you're better off not looking desperate. And the bottom line is there really aren't too many investors that you absolutely have to have. So, don't ask for money. They know why you're there. The only time I mention it is when we're about to close. I say, hey, we're closing. I understand you might not be interested. Just want you to know, if you're interested, I need to know, within 48 hours. That's probably the only time I push on the money button. Otherwise, stick to not being desperate. Ask for advice. They feel respected. They start to trust you, and you'll get a check. Those are my items, Jim.
There we go. Thanks, Todd. I think, again, add to the set of good, I think, good conversation starters. So with that, let's transition over to Clayton and your thoughts.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So what I'm about to say probably pertains better to pre-Series A startups. I just wanted to preface with that. So I wanted to start off with mindset. So like Todd mentioned, you're either in full-time fundraising mode or you're not fundraising. And I always think of it as there's always an opportunity cost. And personally, I like spending time more with our customers instead of investors. And the longer you're in fundraising mode, of course, the worse your sales growth can be. So hopefully you have a co-founder who can keep the product online or the sales going while you, the CEO, is in fundraising mode. And again, you're either in fundraising mode full-time or you're not fundraising. The next bullet that I wanted to cover was more about the process. And to me, it's about sample size, sample size, sample size. Essentially, fundraising is like a sales funnel and sales process as well. Prior to jumping into tech startups about 7 years ago, I played poker professionally. And poker helped me to realize and become more process-oriented than results-oriented. And that's because throughout my career, both playing online and live poker, I played a few million hands. I lost most of those hands in most of those tournaments. But where almost all my ROI came from was a very small fraction of hands in tournaments that I played. When it comes to fundraising, it's a similar process. So as an example, our friends and family round a few years ago, we talked with 70 investors and had 3 checks in. Angel round, almost 500 investors because I made the mistake of not really realizing what investors and what type of investors to go after. In that round, we ended up only taking checks from about 10 investors. And the recent round, very similar size. So a few hundred investors talked to, just a handful of investors came in. So at the end of the day, if you have to get through 99 no's to get to 1 yes, it's just all about that sample size and repeating that process. And then lastly, which I know JD mentioned for execution capital, it's all about de-risking plus adding FOMO, in my opinion, for closing a round. And JD was spot on with execution capital. Instead of going towards, we're raising this round, we're raising X, and a big portion of it goes towards R&D. That's adding risk for the investors. Whereas if you can tell them that we're raising, let's say, a $500,000 round and it gets us to 1.2 million annual recurring revenue, that helps to tell that story. To back that up, you need to think about the actual data from your company, whether it's your unit economics, your customer acquisition cost, and then also to de-risk and create that FOMO. The better you understand and know your customer, the better the investors will feel. So for instance, with Nebulum, where we build indoor farms and sell direct to consumer, we collect a lot of data. We're pretty obsessive over that. So our average customer right now is a 53-year-old female living in a home valued of $325,000 or more, and their annual income is $90,000 plus. So as long as we understand that, who that customer is and who our customer is and what it costs us to get them, and we show that we can cookie cutter this across the US and globally, then that gets investors excited. They can see more of the upside. And that's what I had for this morning, Jim.
Thank you very much, Clayton. Again, I think that those will certainly add to the discussion. And I imagine at this point, people have already begun to see how many, even though it wasn't designed specifically this way, many of the points kind of play off of each other quite well. Let's shift to Mike, who brings a little different perspective, being directly in the investment community. Mike.
Well, good morning. Pleasure to be here. The first point I have is something that I read a long time ago in a blog post. I can't remember whether it was Brad Feld or who wrote it, but it was never be casual. And I think maybe that's never be unprepared or never be unfocused. On the investor side of the table, you've known your consultants, you've known your partners, you've known those people for a long time. We get very small glimpses into who you are. And whether it's a phone call or a personal meeting or an email, each one of those adds up to who we think we're working with. And I can think of a person who I met last fall in a Zoom meeting. The first time presented the business, I was really impressed with him. At the end of the meeting, we got to a point which was something that seemed like kind of a big deal. and he really wasn't prepared to talk about it. And he promised to follow through with information, never did. The second time I met with the person was on a referral, and this time he wasn't very focused, and that dramatically changes the perception of who am I working with here. And so each one of those adds up to being a point in a decision-making process. But again, multiple people have said it's about the people, and you've got to keep in mind that every one of those points matters. The second point, you look at who you're competing against as a business, but when you're raising money, it's a sales process, obviously. And you have to remember, you're competing against other people raising money that are in that investor's pipeline. We can't, we're going to invest in 3% or 5% of the deals that come across our desks. And so in the time that I've been doing this, I haven't had one person yet ask how their business fits into our portfolio, or better yet, tell me how their business fits into our portfolio. And that can often be a deal changer in terms of how we perceive that business and find synergies with the folks we already know. The last point is just an operational one, where I've seen this occur a couple of times. People form their teams, and especially when they're larger teams, they divvy out equity. And what folks often don't recognize is that the co-founders own that equity going forward, and they can decide to leave the company. They cannot contribute like what everybody thought they were going to, and they're largely going to keep that equity. And so a strategy to deal with that, and sometimes what's baked into the investors' criteria to invest, is that founders have to vest their shares. So you may own 20% of the company, but you have to earn that back over a period of 3 or 5 years, or you have to meet certain performance requirements and to actually be able to hold that equity. And as a co-founder, it should give you comfort that the people who are coming in to do business with you have to earn that equity. It's not just a gift from the beginning of what you hope they're going to contribute. So those are my 3 points.
Great, thank you very much, Mike. And last, but only last because of her last name, Susan, I'll let you wrap up this section of the session.
Thanks, Jim, and I appreciate going after Mike, because he teed up my first bullet point very, very well. I think learnings, advice would be to make sure when you're getting an investment, you align your vision, your goals of the company, and it's aligned with the vision of the investor itself and their criteria for growth. Sometimes you're very excited to get money and to grow your business and to be able to execute on that, but you really have to understand the investor's criteria for growth, the growth of their fund, understand where you are in their investment in their fund, first company in versus last. Their criteria may be different. And they're going to reference them too. You don't have to ask them for references, but do your diligence on them. You always want a partnership that gets through the ebbs and flows of an innovation cycle. They are investing in you for those ebbs and flows. They know it's not always going to be a streamlined process, but I would reverse the criteria and say, make sure that you understand their experience in doing that as well. So that would be number one. Really understand your investor syndicate and make sure you're aligned with their investment criteria. The second is, you're getting a financing. You have to execute against the goals or your use of funds for that financing, but then you're going to need a subsequent financing more than likely. So understand the ability of the syndicate to help get access to more capital, for example, and your ability to do that as well. but in the execution phase, understand the access to talent to support your growth and other supply chain, like your legal, your financial, your recruitment, to be able to fuel the growth of your business. So this is, one investment leads to the next. You really want to understand and make sure that you understand the ability of the syndicate, yourself, the community to be able to access that next phase of investment. And the third thing is, and I'll just say it's an aerobic capacity of the investor. We're a healthcare investment, and the healthcare investment is often closer to a marathon than it is a sprint. So the aerobic capacity is really important because you need different waypoints for that growth. You need clinical growth. You need regulatory approvals. Often you'll need a reimbursement requirement. And a lot of those waypoints need to be accomplished pre-revenue. So, but there's still valuation components of growth before revenue, but they're really important. So the healthcare investment is often considered among the longest ones, and make sure that your syndicate has that aerobic capacity for the type of investment you are. So those are my 3 points.
Excellent. Thanks. Thanks very much to all of you for those. I think that has all hopefully provided some fodder for subsequent discussion. So what I'd like to do at this point is turn over kind of the facilitation of the session to John Callan, who, as I mentioned before, is the entrepreneur in residence for the Accelerator program, and he'll facilitate the Q&A and conversation from here out. So, John.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. It appears we have no questions in the chat box just yet. So all attendees out there, if you can direct any questions to me in the chat box, and we'll get those offered out. I'll start since we don't have any questions. Actually, one just came in. What are some, this is directed to all the panelists, what are some resources and top of the funnel channels to find active investors? So I'll direct that to all the panelists if one of you.
John, do you mind repeating that for us?
Yeah, sorry. What are some resources and top of the funnel channels to find active investors?
Yeah, I could start. I think one is various angel groups. I'll use the example of Plains Angels in Des Moines. And different angel groups act differently, of course. What I've experienced with that group, it's fairly casual. It's not like they automatically have a fund that they invest in you. But for us, we've gotten several we've had a lot of investor interest come out of that, some of which have invested, but separately, individually. So it's just a way to meet a bunch of local investors, angel investors. And what you really need, though, of course, is a link of someone there that can introduce you and in that way give you enough credibility to get in front of them. So hopefully you have a network where someone can introduce you. Usually, if you're hooked in with someone like JD, Jim, others, you can get an introduction to any number of angel groups. That's a great way to start, I think.
This is Mike Yupa. I would throw out, and this is from my time at the Papa John Centers. A lot of times, an entrepreneur, it seems like the content of their initial business plan is they've listened to one opinion, and they've created a product, and they priced that product, and they don't have this big body of knowledge that's fueling their startup. And I think that an accelerator program, whether it's Papa John Centers or Go to Market or whatever, is a great place to understand where is the bar set, so that the first time I have an interaction with an investor, I'm bringing credibility to the table. So I think that there's now more accelerator programs and incubators than there ever have been. And that is a great place to get started. They know the investment community and can help you understand how to put your best foot forward.
Great. Anyone else want to weigh in on that, Susan?
Yeah, sorry, I probably, there's probably a function here where I can raise my hand remotely, but I think there are, depending on where you are, if it's your first investment, there's certainly investor conferences that you can access and have ability to meet angel investors, for example. If it's not your first round, I would go back to your current syndicate and their ability to go after broader capital for the next round of financing. That's part of what the series A, B, and C is for them to be able to at least have some reach out to that next phase of financing. So I think if it's a past Series A type of financing, look to your current syndicate. If it's a first round of financing, I would agree with Mike. There's a lot of resources available to you. I think in my experience, it's been the IEDA has been fabulous in this area for us, and also VentureNet Iowa. Both have been able to reach out to the local community and give access or at least introductions to investors.
John?
Yes.
Another area, to Susan's point, maybe in a later round, is starting to look at those strategic investors that can bring either distribution, technology, customers to the forefront. It can be self-limiting as well, because you got to be careful. Does it handcuff you to go out to the rest of the market? But there is a right time to understand who the strategic investors that can bring a lot more than just financing to you. And we always focus there as well.
Fantastic.
John, I would like to add too, I recently wrote about this, and there's a lot of people, especially in this remote day and age, putting together Airtable databases of investors at various stages, and then some paths to getting warm introductions to them. I'm sending it to you, Hannah, a link if that could be shared with everybody. Thanks.
Fantastic. The fire hose is on. We're getting a lot of good questions, so I'll attempt to keep up with them. This question is directed to JD and Susan. For those companies that will be going through some kind of regulatory clearance approval, example for medical devices, how important is it that the company have a solid idea of the regulatory requirements, timelines, and costs when they're seeking early funding?
Hey, Susan.
Want me to go?
Yeah.
I think the regulatory process is part of your investment strategy. It has to be from the beginning. Even your reimbursement process, even though you're not going to get that later, you have to understand when that would come in the long-term financing. So we always incorporate. I would encourage everyone to always incorporate what the regulatory requirement is, when you expect it to when you expect it to happen, but you have to build your solution with the understanding of how it's going to be regulated from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, we've worked with a lot of companies, efforting towards a 510K and all of that, and Susan's a lot more expertise at that than I am, but it's really laying out that timeline and understanding. What we always focus on too is what the potential exit could be, what the opportunities are, what the actual market is. But it's a little unique, and in those rounds, valuation is somewhat subjective, but you're always focusing on the end opportunity in the marketplace.
Fantastic.
John, one thing that I just add briefly to that, obviously, for a medical device, group that's going to go through like an FDA, regulatory might be, very top of mind, but there are other fields as well, other sectors that have some of those same elements and the same basic truths hold.
And to that point, Jim, I lead with that, right? Lead with those obstacles. Don't avoid those obstacles when you're talking to investors. Let them know what that path is and what those challenges are, versus trying to mask those and think, oh, we're just going to get those approvals. Lead with that process and let them understand that process.
I think that is an important part of what Todd's talk track was. That level of trust and leading with that at the beginning, you know, the regulatory process is just an example of that, but it certainly can't be a surprise. When is it coming? How much is it going to cost? It might not be what you're asking for funds for now, but it's certainly you know, with your initial investor, they're going to want to know that the next round would cover that, for example, and you know, when their exit would be. So aligning your investment, aligning your vision and your timeline with your syndicate.
Yeah, this is Mark. I think that's really important to consider with the federal money as well. Different agencies had different, you know, timelines. NIH, for instance, National Institutes of Health, understands the timeline on medical is very long. And they now offer what they call a phase 2B continuation grant that goes beyond phase 2 and can be up to 3 years and $3 million to help focus on those regulatory issues and do human studies. And so the later stages of SBIR dovetail with private investment and leveraging, including matching funds, to take care of a lot of those regulatory issues that agencies like NIH have to deal with.
Fantastic. So just stepping back a second, Clayton, I know this is something, an issue you've raised in the past. Would like to get some of the panelists' perspectives on business formation considerations, structure, vesting schedules, states of incorporation, some of the challenges you all have encountered related to those issues. Maybe Clayton, start with you.
Yeah, for us, you know, we took the easy path to get started as an Iowa LLC. Then we realized a couple of years in, we needed to become a Delaware Corp to continue raising. And from that perspective, you know, I thought it'd be a smooth transition. It wasn't. And something that I was really surprised by was, so for any of us who have gone through IADA and received funding for POCR, demonstration fund, Propel fund, et cetera. So at the time of transitioning for us, we had received POCR and demonstration fund, a total of 125,000. And then we realized there's a tax trigger event. And of course, the cap table was responsible. It was really messy. We ended up having to hire a tax attorney for $600 an hour to get us through that. So we lit some money on fire as far as transitioning from one entity to another. On the other side of that, vesting, talking with a lot of peers who are founders of various stage companies in the area, I had no idea there were so many different ways to vest. So for instance, we do a 4-year vesting schedule with a 1-year cliff, monthly vesting. So essentially at 12 months in, they're 1/4 vested. The founders, we went back to that as well when raising our second round. So we're vesting right alongside of all of our employees. I think that's important. But just trying to understand if there was a go-to resource for especially Iowa technology companies starting of, you know, if you go this route, this is, let's say, your exit plan, and this is how you're going to grow your team. If you go this route, then sure, it's going to cost less than legal fees up front, but you're probably going to run into a problem down the road.
Yeah, we've certainly seen, you know, a lot of early stage companies that have, you know, angel investors, you know, form as LLCs. And really what an LLC is a flow through entity, right? So the investors have the opportunity to share in those losses, have tax deductions, et cetera. When you move into institutional investors or a venture capital firm, they don't want their limited partners to have flow through, you know, challenges on taxes and all of that, whether they be income or losses. So a lot of times when you move to those institutional rounds, they'll require you to be a C Corp. A lot of companies in the old days used to develop as S Corps as well. S Corps are good. I mean, they're treated from a tax perspective very similar to an LLC, but S Corps cannot have any commercial entity or an institutional investor into it. They lose their S Corp election. So there's advantages to you know, the LLC perspective, but most institutional investors don't want any of that flow through tax coming back to them. And for that reason, You know, most of the time they'll want you to flip to a C Corp. A lot of funds, a lot of incubators and accelerators require C Corps because they don't want the flow through back to their partners as well. And then, you know, there's certain advantages as well for C Corps with regard to tax advantages and all that we could spend an hour talking about. But LLC has its advantages, particularly for individual investors.
Great, thank you. Another question that has come in, would like to get all the panelists' perspectives on how they think about and consider and or approach non-dilutive versus equity-based funding. Obviously, you know, we have folks that have received both on occasion. So thoughts on that?
I'll jump in here quickly. I think that the non-dilutive funding, sort of a debt funding, you know, just for example, right now, the debt markets are very good for investment. I tend to look at them as the ability to extend our runway from a current round to be able to hit more goals for a next round of equity financing. But it is with the advantages that it's non-dilutive capital. And I think, you know, obviously it depends on the terms. You have to really be focused on what the covenants are. Again, I would look into that debt provider to determine not what happens in the good times, but what happens in the bad times and how they reacted to the company. Can you rework those covenants for debt if you need to? So but I tend to look at it as an ability to extend our runway, to increase building valuation in the company before the next equity round of financing. And with that higher valuation from the next equity round of financing, everyone does better.
I'll throw in to echo everything that Susan just mentioned. So bring on the non-dilutive funding. Something that helps me to try to figure out which direction to go after is thinking in terms of expected value. So I know, Mark, your hit rate is much higher than like the national average, but in the past, when we've started thinking about a round, we've looked at, let's say, an SBIR, NSF, going after, you know, 200,000, where it's a 15% success rate. So I see that as our expected value is $30,000, and it's going to take us a couple hundred hours to go through that process and the timeline. So then, because of that timeline and that length of time it's going to take us, that's forced us to go back into going the equity route, because we feel like our hit rate with angel investors is a much higher expected value.
Yeah, you know, the non-dilutive options certainly depend on the likelihood of getting them and how big they are and how much time you spend. So you have to go through that. But generally speaking, of course, non-dilutive options like debt, I think, are an automatic. My first inclination is yes, until you get into the details and figure it all out. But I prefer, obviously, non-dilutive. The harder question, I think, is when you're raising money, particularly in the current climate, I think several are finding they could raise more than they planned. And of course, that dilutes. And do you go ahead and pull that trigger? And most advice I get is, yes, you know, bigger war chest, the better, particularly in a technology, we're in biotech area where no one's ever gone out of business for having too much money, but you do dilute, right? So to me, that's the tougher question, is when do you turn off the faucet? And if you have that problem, and we have had that issue in the past in certain instances. So that's the difficult one. And I don't have a standard advice there, except check with your current investors to find out their favorable attitudes towards or not towards dilution.
And I guess a follow-up for the folks on the panel that have received non-dilutive funding, have you found that it's helped, you know, sort of leverage follow-on private equity, or excuse me, follow-on equity-based investment, especially, you know, the state funding programs through Iowa?
So it's for us, the state funding programs through Iowa have been, essential and have absolutely catalyzed the next level of investment. Our latest round of financing, we received non-dilutive funds from the state. That was got us another investment from Unity Point Health into the fund that was very strategic for us. So they did a match, and the Unity Point Health investment was instrumental in our next round of financing, that level of investment. So it's just the non-dilutive funding from the state. I've been on record many times saying how important this was to what we've done, and it's been instrumental in our growth.
For us, the state funding has also been critical, but I think the SBIR funding brings more credibility to a broader array of investors that say, wow, you have this check mark from an independent refereed panel that said they like what you're doing. And that has probably given significant follow-on investment. So that's kind of an intangible when you're putting in all that time to the benefits of an SBIR grant.
Yeah, and John, I would just say, I mean, it's another level of external validation, right? And a lot of times we've leveraged the fact that the state funding has equity matching, right? So you're able to carry that on, and it's been through that process. And so we've certainly leveraged that validation process to be able to go get actual equity for the company as well.
Yeah.
I'll mention, go ahead, Mark.
I mean, SBIR is designed to enable private funding, not compete with it. And, the point I was making is that you can sit down and evaluate the trade-offs between the value of a phase one versus angel funding. Most phase ones that qualify as feasibility studies are not going to get angel funding, because the angel funding people are going to say you're not ready yet. So it's not really a choice. If you're at a point where there's a choice between any private funding beyond the 4Fs and SBIR, then you're probably too far along for a lot of SBIR. So again, I think it's hand in hand. SBIR enables the private funding, even at the angel level. Phase one enables angel level investment in phase two. And one of the things is that, phase one's now up to about 250,000 most places. Some are 300,000. It used to be 33. So if you win one phase one at NIH, and you do it strategically and do phase two and phase 2B with the matching funds you bring in for the phase 2B, you're talking about $5 to $7 million based on one phase one. And yeah, the timeline's long, but you may not get that money any other way, and it's non-dilutive. So that's the value of leveraging SBIR with the private money.
I wanted to mention too that VentureNet through IDA has been key for us, and we were able to time demonstration fund. When we received that, we used that to kind of kick off fundraising, and that was key for like our interview to get into Y Combinator for their accelerator. We were able to tell them in the interview we've raised 200,000 in the last 30 days, and 100,000 is non-dilutive. I think that's key, and I'm noticing a lot of friends with companies now who are using, POCR or demonstration fund to then kick off fundraising. And at the end of the day, that's, I think, really, really smart. You're continuing to de-risk it for investors.
Thanks. And I will highlight to all the attendees out there that we are posting links to all these funding programs in the chat box, the IEDA funding programs, SBIR through Jim Register's group, et cetera. So Jim, I assume as we get towards the end, we can reference how we can make those resources available to everyone on this call.
Yep.
So
Can I add?
Go ahead.
I wanted to call out one thing that was embedded in some of the comments, but not pulled out really discreetly. And that is, you know, the question was initially posed around sort of dilutive, non-dilutive, but not all, and I'll leave dilutive, I'll leave equity investment aside. Think about those as one lump of a type of funding one can get. You know, the differences and how you approach using a loan from a private entity, kind of back to, you know, one of Susan's points, perhaps how to help bridge around or how to get you to a next big slug of revenue that can enable you to move forward, versus a loan program like the state runs that folks have kind of teed that up, versus SBIRs. They all have niches where they're really good fits and they're really bad fits, you know, in a lot of other niches. And Clayton brought that out, you know, to one extent when he talked about some of the decisions he made around, you know, SBIRs and so forth. So again, it's a place where feeling like whether it's legal and finance together, that advice and feeling that you're getting quality of advice can be really essential, particularly if you haven't been through it before.
Fantastic. This question is for Mike, but other panelists can weigh in as well. We always hear that, you know, Iowa investors, you know, are more conservative than folks on the coast, and also tend to focus a lot of their investments in ag-based enterprises. What are you sort of seeing, or if you could characterize sort of the investment environment in Iowa or the greater Midwest, if you could, you know, provide some general characterizations of what you're seeing?
We are seeing a lot of ag tech, and I think that is just a maturation of our entrepreneurs and moving away from just basic farming to see the value added side and the ways to make agriculture more efficient with tools and techniques. So we are seeing a lot of that. But again, we're seeing healthcare, we're seeing software. I mean, it's all across the board. I do think that Iowa investors are, I don't know if conservative is the right word. I think they're very practical. What have you accomplished? What do you need this bag of money for? What could you get done if you didn't have this bag of money that would de-risk what you're doing? You've brought 2 prospective customers to the table. What's keeping you from bringing 3 or 5 or 10 more to the table? Is it only money, or is it time? Is it effort? What is it? So, but I would agree, there is a conservative mindset, and some of that is the investment base hasn't been as large as it is now. And so it was a buyer's market, and had the opportunity to be pretty choosy about what was invested in. As we've gotten more and more funds in the state, you see some deals being done that we passed on that other people liked, and maybe that was that the deal changed, but I would say we're seeing all kinds of stuff, and I think if you've hit the buttons on the market and you bring in good validation and traction to the table, you're going to get rid of that conservative nature, and you're going to get people who say, okay, these people have accomplished something and we want to be part of it.
If I could just add to that a little bit, I would say that the funds on the coast may be structured differently, that they're built, example, around 1 in 10 making it. I think that I'm not sure that the Iowa funds are necessarily built like that it's 10% hit rate. To Mike's point, I totally agree. With more money into the state, more funds, you're getting better terms on the deals themselves from a seller's point of view. And I think that that's good for the innovation community to have better term sheets that are coming from the local investors. But I do think that that's a little bit more, supply and demand. It's evened out a bit more. So I wouldn't say maybe conservative is the right word. I think that the funds are just structured differently, and the returns on those funds just need different things. I definitely agree that you build your business and you keep hitting your milestones, and things are going to turn out well. Eventually, the companies within the state will probably need to reach out to the coast for that subsequent round of financing to get a bigger round. So you're building that you're building the structure and the value of your company here for that bigger round.
I'd like to mention too that I've just been in the tech space here in Iowa for 7 years, and something that I'm proud of for our ecosystem and our community is, 3 years ago we were trying to raise off of a post money safe, which was essentially a foreign language here in Iowa. And now I noticed, so I'm pretty sure Global Insurance Accelerator uses safes. I know Iowa Startup Accelerator is using safes. I think that's a step in the right direction to adopting, framework that helps processes move more efficiently for both founders and investors.
Clayton, as a follow-up, if you could explain to the attendees what you're referencing there, post-money saves.
So a document created by the attorneys at Y Combinator to get financing done. So it stands for Simple Agreement for Future Equity. There's essentially only one point to negotiate, and that's the valuation cap. Whereas you could argue all day long whether convertible notes and the interest rate makes sense if it's founder friendly, investor friendly, et cetera. But essentially a SAFE can get the fundraising process done more efficiently because you only negotiate one thing. And at the end of it too, it's a rolling basis too for SAFEs. And SAFEs are treated as securities, whereas convertible.
SAFEs, convertible debt, whatever instrument you want to use, can be great tools. But the challenge is, from an investor's perspective, is why am I signing a SAFE when you took other non-dilutive funding and you gave those people a position, a security position? Why am I being left out in the cold? And so I think you've got to think about how am I going to manage all of these entities that are financing so that I can create reasonable terms across the board. Too often SAFE is a bit of a crutch, and when do I get converted is a big question.
So follow-up question or a question for Todd, but others can weigh in. Todd, you had a great phrase, hunt where the ducks are, which was well received there. How do you do due diligence on prospective investors? Obviously there's the standard channels, PitchBook, Crunchbase, et cetera, but how do you really dive in to do the due diligence on potential folks?
Yeah, well, for us, we mostly have angel investors. We have some strategic investors, venture capital, strategic venture firms. We don't have a traditional venture capital firm. So for angel investors, you can learn pretty quick, and I think you can manage any mistakes you make there. I don't think that's a hugely impactful, thing that you have to watch. You do have to be careful, for sure. But others maybe will answer better as they move down the road with certain venture capital firms. For us, in our network of ag tech, it's networking with others who are using these firms. To me, that's the best way to go. And you get really honest answers from people who feel like they are your comrade. If it's a conversation, I'm not saying they're going to send you an email and list it all out, but I'd say network with other entrepreneurs that are using some of these firms. To me, that's the best way. And you can go on their websites and see all the companies they've invested in, and likely you have connections into these other firms as well. So that would be number one. And I've done quite a bit of that. In the end, we haven't had a traditional VC firm invest in us. And that was okay. We filled up things quickly with angel investors and strategic investors.
Great, thank you. Anyone else would like to weigh in there? Jim?
Just a quick comment following up on something Todd said. One thing that's true for ag companies, and it's very different, for instance, from a situation that, say, Susan would be in, because I think of where a lot of the angels' money has come from in Iowa and in the Midwest, you find situations with ag tech companies like what Todd described, where you can get up to some really large rounds driven off of some powerful angels. You move outside of ag, that situation is not the same. So again, just kind of something for people to think about.
I would echo that
Great.
point. I mean, for an early stage investor, the fact that one of those big players might come in with a round behind us, that potential exists is pretty comforting. So, and maybe that's why we've seen more ag deals and we've invested in more ag deals.
Question for Mark Henry. Have any of your clients that you worked with in the past received phase 3 contracts? And if so, can you outline what has made them successful getting to that level, phase 3?
Well, interesting. An interesting point is that phase 3 is kind of in quotes. Phase 3 in the SBIR program is whatever happens after phase 2 or phase 2B. SBIR can use funds for anything labeled phase 1 or phase 2 something, phase 2B, phase 2 plus. So some agencies are putting, as I said, up to 5-6 million into some of the projects they fund. Others stop at $1.5 million. So whatever happens after the phase 2 money runs out is technically phase 3. And we do have successes in the phase 3 arena. A lot of those successes are licensing plays with private sector partners, industry companies, and others involve investor funding, others involve partnerships with marketing companies or manufacturing companies. And some of our Iowa companies are headed that direction that we've been supporting. When I was at Bend Research, we spun off 5 companies based on the patented technology we came up because we were working as a contract R&D house mostly. We spun off 5 companies with partners, and that counted as phase 3. So phase 3 can be a lot of different things. And licensing, I think, especially in the health arena, but in others as well, licensing for DoD products is the main thing to be planning on. You don't sell the DoD out of your garage. They're pretty picky about who they're buying from. So anyway, the possibilities are pretty broad for phase 3. I think conventionally people think of phase 3 as making and selling products. And phase 3, as I said, is whatever happens after phase 2. And most of it isn't just starting your own manufacturing plant and selling products worldwide. So it's really hard to come up with any specific types of things you're going to be doing.
Mark, is there more you'd say about contracting agencies versus more true granting agencies in that regard? You touched on DoD.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent point. One thing very few people people understand and the agencies aren't good at talking about is the huge difference between grants and contracts. Everybody says they're writing a grant, they're getting a grant writer, everybody's going to win a grant. About 60% of the SBIR program is contracts. And most of that money is from DOD, although some of it is also from NASA. And contracts are fulfillment efforts where you've got to meet milestones and meet criteria, and DOD can buy it from you. And so phase 3 with DOD can often be selling to DOD. The contract agencies are built-in customers for the most part. Grant agencies almost never buy anything you're developing. And so you've got to find other interest to take your phase 3 grant to market. But as I say, DOD can be a built-in contract, and but they don't buy from small companies very often. That's why it's a licensing play with prime contractors at DOD, and you should, from phase 1 on, be looking for prime contractors who are going to be the licensing partner. An interesting thing about SBIR that most people don't know is that the law allows even a phase 1 winner of SBIR to sell sole source to the government without any competition. Nobody seems to know that. Nobody seems to use that. But you cross the competitive bidding hurdle with the government with a phase 1 win, let alone phase 2. And that puts you in a position to negotiate with your investors or with a private partner to have access to sole source selling within the government without competitive bids. So a lot of value that's added to a phase 1 winner that gives them a negotiating value for deals.
Fantastic, thank you. We have time for one more question, and then I'll pass it back to Jim Register to wrap up and closing remarks. Question directed to all the panelists. What are some key questions to ask strategic investors when you're doing the vetting? Obviously, we know what they're going to be asking you all for the investment, but what do you need to be asking them? Example, size of fund, their timelines, et cetera.
So from a strategic investor, you need like a venture capital, not a potential acquirer of the company that would get into your. So I think maybe I'll start off if it's okay and just say I think what their criteria for the fund is. So it's really important to get that match, what they want to do. Maybe more subtle point is where you are in the fund. So if they have a fund that has 10 investments and you're going to be 10 of 10, they're going to probably want your exit timeline to be shorter than the rest of the first 9, so that's kind of a different, kind of a component of what you should know about them, what their normal full investment number is for you. So they're going to invest a certain amount and they're going to follow on. But I think just what their returns, are they looking for 3x returns in 4 years? That's a really important number or series of numbers that you should know.
Yeah, John, I actually, I view a strategic as bringing a lot more than just capital to the table. So it's somebody that can help deliver customers, distribution, technology, vertical integration into their customer base. And so, the main questions are to ask is, how they see the fit and what they see the opportunity and what they bring to the table. And so that, we always say we want to look for smart money, meaning more than just, true financial. And so it's really asking them how they see it and what they bring to the table and how dedicated they are bringing to the table. A lot of times it's great to bring a strategic in because in a way now they're vested in your interest, right? So they're going to focus their corporate resources on your future as well. So it's really making sure you understand how you fit in, and if it's a large corporation, into their corporate bureaucracy and who you're dealing with there. And do they have that same entrepreneurial mind thought that you have?
I would throw out that, we have a reputation for never saying no. And, what's the upside for a VC to say no? We like to watch the deal. Things can change. And so we tend to drag our feet on this. If we're dragging our feet, it's because there's something we don't like. And so you need to ask us, what is it? What is the reason you're dragging your feet? Is it concern over IP? Is it concern over competition? We'll be honest. We'll tell you, here is why we didn't write a check yesterday. But you probably got to ask us to get that answer.
And I'll add on the strategic investor front that I think you have to really understand the effect that will have on other customers you have who are their competitors, and be very clear on firewalls between the venture group, the rest of the company. And I've found the personal philosophy, I call it personal, but the contact you have, your main contact within the venture group, what's their goal? I mean, it should be the venture group's goal, but are they really interested in getting a return on their investment, or are they really interested in what you assume is the interest of benefiting the company as a whole by getting closer access to your technology? And I think it's all over the board, because some venture capital, financial oriented people just want to win with their investments. And that's quite different than really trying to help the larger organization get a close look at your technology. And so consider those two things, particularly how are other potential customers going to look at you once you hook arms with that strategic investor. And most of the time it's good because they want you all the more, but it may not always be that way.
One thing I would
just
say, sorry.
One thing I was just thinking of, something that I wish we would have known early on in fundraising. Whenever we're kicking off fundraising, the first question that now we ask is, do you lead rounds? That's been pretty key for us, since most investors won't. So you can save a lot of time up front with understanding and identifying which investors lead rounds. And then for us, understanding the average check size, the timeline to making a yes/no decision, and that process to make that decision. And I like to, at the end of the first meeting, ask how many deals they've done in the last 12 months. That helps us become more realistic with their timelines.
One thing I would ask is whether they're interested in new product development and letting the company continue with SBIRs, or if they want to just have the company focus on their investment and the target for their investment. One reason a lot of SBIRs end up being licensing plays is because the companies that do SBIRs like to do research, and they like pursuing new products. And a lot of private investors won't let them get distracted by new ideas. They want them to focus on return on investment for what they invested in. And so you got to make a decision as a small company whether you want an investment that's going to force you to focus on that, and that's a good thing. Focus is a good thing. Or if you're more interested in licensing those rights in some way and continuing pursuing new ideas. You got to look at your company and see what the people in the company really want to be doing.
Great, thank you all. Jim, if you want to.
Sounds good. And Hannah, if you could pop up that last slide maybe while I'm talking, that would be great. So a couple things very quick to wrap up. First, most important, probably, thanks again. Sincere thanks to all the panelists. I thought this discussion went certainly as well as I think I could have hoped for, given the restrictions of a virtual sort of setup. I'll add to that, any event like this, and particularly one like this that's being run for the first time, it's an experiment. And in this case, the data from this experiment is feedback from the audience, from the participants. So we really do welcome feedback from anyone who attended today, not just the current cohort of G2M companies, but feedback about, you know, the approach we took, what we might do better, et cetera, because I think if we find a way to make events like this work, then I think there's some real upside to finding ways to continue. So with that, I'll sign off. Best of luck to everyone. And for folks located in Iowa, find a way to stay cool today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Panelists, very much.